"You are not what I ordered," said the Duke of Lowmoor, looking his bride over from the doorway, as though a tradesman had delivered the wrong cloth. He said it carelessly, the way a man says a thing he has not troubled to weigh, and he said it loudly enough that the half-dozen guests assembled in his great hall to welcome the future Duchess heard every word. Jonas had married Persephone Wells 3 weeks before on a contract drawn between their fathers, sight largely unseen, and he had arrived at his own estate that afternoon expecting, he was not entirely sure what, someone more dazzling, someone whose arrival would make the men he despised envy him. What he had got, he thought, surveying the quiet woman in the travelling gown who had risen to greet him, was a perfectly ordinary gentlewoman, and the disappointment soured in him and came out of his mouth before his judgment could stop it. "I beg your pardon," said Persephone. "I said you are not what I ordered." He pulled off his gloves, one finger at a time, not looking at her now. "No matter, one makes do. I had been led to expect a beauty. I find I have married a governess. Well, the estate is large enough that we need not trouble each other often." A small silence opened in the great hall. One of the ladies present put her teacup down with exaggerated care. Jonas, already turning toward his study, did not see his wife's face change, did not see the brief flinch swiftly mastered, nor the thing that settled into place behind her eyes after it, cool and clear and final. He expected tears, he half expected a scene. He had braced with weary contempt for reproaches. What he did not expect was the sound of her voice, perfectly steady, addressing his retreating back. "Your Grace." He stopped, turned. She had crossed the hall to him, and now, in front of every staring guest, she drew off the ring, the heavy Lowmoor betrothal ring, the gold and the great square emerald that had been on the hand of every duchess for 200 years, and held it out to him on her open palm. "You ordered a beauty," Persephone said quietly, "and received a governess. I ordered a husband, and received a man who would humiliate his wife before strangers within an hour of meeting her. It seems we are both disappointed. But only one of us intends to be gracious about it." She set the ring down on the long hall table between them, where it caught the lamplight and burned green. "I shall not trouble you often, Your Grace. I shall not trouble you at all." And she gathered her travelling cloak from the chair where she had laid it, and put it on with unhurried hands, and walked out of his great hall and out of his front door into the grey afternoon, not weeping, not flouncing, simply leaving, with the unanswerable dignity of a woman who has decided her own worth and declines to debate it. Jonas stood looking at the ring on the table. He told himself that first night that it was a relief. He had spoken too sharply. Perhaps he was not a man given to apology, but he could privately concede he had been ungracious. Yet the marriage had been a yoke, and now the yoke had loosened itself. She had gone to her aunt's house in the next county. His steward informed him. She had taken nothing but what was hers. She had left no message. Good, Jonas thought. He poured himself a glass and did not drink it. Good. The emerald sat on the hall table for a week before he found he could not bear the sight of it, and had it put away. It was the quality of the silence that he had not foreseen. He had lived alone before. He was a man who prized his solitude, who had married only because the contract advanced the family and not because he wished for company. But this was a different silence. It was the silence of a house that had, for a single afternoon, held the possibility of someone in it, and now did not. He kept absurdly hearing her voice, not weeping, not pleading, steady. "Only one of us intends to be gracious about it." The phrase followed him through the long galleries and sat down with him at his enormous solitary table and lay awake with him in the dark. He had called her a governess as an insult. It began slowly to occur to him that he did not actually know whether she would have made a poor one or a fine one, because he had not addressed a single question to her in his whole hour of marriage. That was not contempt. The guests had talked, of course. Such things always travelled. Within a fortnight it was known throughout the county that the Duke of Lowmoor had so insulted his bride on their first meeting that she had handed back the ring and walked out before the tea was cold, and, to his considerable astonishment, society did not take his part. He had expected sympathy, a man saddled with a plain wife, freed of an inconvenient match. Instead, he found cool glances and conversations that stopped when he entered. An old dowager he had always rather admired looked at him across a card table and said, with devastating mildness, "I hear your wife has beautiful manners, Lowmoor. A pity you'll see so little of them," and turned back to her hand. He went home and could not sleep. It would have been simpler if she had wronged him. He could have nursed a grievance and grown comfortable in it. But there was no grievance to nurse. He turned it over and over in the dark, and every time arrived at the same intolerable place. The fault was his, entire, unshared. She had been delivered to a stranger's house, alone, and had stood up to greet her husband, and her husband had looked at her and announced to a roomful of people that she was the wrong cloth. He had done that. No one had made him. There had been a woman with steady grey eyes and beautiful manners standing in his hall hoping, perhaps, was it so impossible, to be liked, and he had reached out and broken thing before it had drawn its first breath. A month after she left, the Duke of Lowmoor did something he had never in his life done. He sat down at his desk and he wrote a letter of apology. He wrote it badly. He wrote it 4 times. The first was stiff and excused himself. He burned it. The second blamed his temper, his fatigue from the road. He burned that too, recognizing it for the coward's letter it was. By the 4th he had stopped trying to soften anything. "I said you were not what I ordered," he wrote. "I have learned since that I had ordered nothing, deserved nothing, and was sent more than I had the wit to recognize. I do not write to ask you to return. I write because you deserved an apology 3 weeks ago and did not get one, and a man who cannot at least pay his debts is worse than I had thought myself even at my worst. I am sorry. The emerald is yours whether you ever wear it or not. So I find is my regret." He signed it and sent it before he could lose his nerve, and then waited, and no answer came. He did not write again. He had no right, he understood, to a correspondence. A single apology was owed and paid, and to press for more would be to make even his contrition about himself. So he did the only thing left to a proud man who has discovered he was wrong. He tried, in her absence, to become someone she would not have been ashamed to have married. It was a strange winter. He dismissed no servant in anger that season, having caught himself once about to and heard her voice instead. He took up the running of the estate with an attention he had never spared it, because he found that work was the one thing that quieted the house. He actually read, the books that had stood unopened, and caught himself wondering what she would have said of them, and resented the wondering, and went on doing it. When the dowager who had rebuked him fell ill, he called and sat with her, and she eyed him shrewdly and said, "You are improved, Lowmoor." And he answered, before he could weigh it, "I had a good teacher for about an hour, and I have been studying her ever since." Word of that travelled too, in the way such things do. It was March when the carriage came. He was crossing the great hall, the same hall, when he heard wheels on the gravel, and went to the window expecting his steward, and saw instead a hired chaise, and a woman in a grey travelling cloak being handed down from it. His heart did a thing it had not done in his entire adult life. He went to the door himself, before the footman could reach it, and opened it, and stood there. Persephone Wells stood on his step with her chin level and her grey eyes steady, exactly as she had been the day she left, except that she was not leaving now, she was arrived. In her gloved hand she held a letter, and he recognized with a lurch his own 4 times written apology, much folded. "You wrote," she said, "that you did not ask me to return." "I did not," Jonas said. His voice was not steady. He had not, in all his rehearsed humility, prepared for the sight of her. "I had no right to ask it." "No," she agreed, "you had not, which is, I find, precisely why I have come." She studied him a moment, and he made himself stand still under it and be looked at, the way she had once stood and been looked at and judged. "I have heard a great deal of you this winter, your grace. I came expecting to dislike the reports as exaggerations. I find them, on inspection, restrained. They tell me you have become a man worth the trouble of knowing. I should like to discover whether that is true before I decide what to do with the rest of my life, which is, you understand, entirely my own to decide now, and not your father's, nor mine." "Yes," Jonas said. "God, yes. Anything. Will you come in? Out of the cold." "I will not. I shall not presume a single thing. You may leave again within the hour, and I shall thank you for the hour." A flicker crossed her face that he had not seen before, because in their one prior meeting he had given her no reason for it. It was very nearly amusement. "I am told," she said, stepping past him into the hall, "that you no longer announce to a roomful of people that your guests are the wrong cloth." "I have given it up entirely," said the Duke of Lowmoor, with feeling. "It cost me a great deal more than I could afford." She stayed for the hour, and then for tea, and then, because the road was long and the light was going, for the night, in rooms at the far end of the house with the door firmly her own, and in the morning she did not call for the chaise. She walked, instead, into the breakfast room, where he had been sitting for an hour not eating, and she sat down across from him, and she said, "You will have to court me properly, you understand, from the beginning, as though that first hour never happened. I will not be married twice to a man who has only got it right the second time by accident." "It would not be by accident," Jonas said. "I have thought of very little else for 4 months. "Then prove it slowly," said Persephone, and reached for the teapot and poured for them both, and it was the most ordinary, domestic, miraculous thing he had ever seen. He courted her through the spring. He courted her in the old galleries and along the estate walks and over the chessboard, where she beat him soundly and refused to let him pretend he had allowed it. He learned, week by week, the wit he had insulted before he had heard it, the dry humour, the kindness that did not announce itself, the steel under the steadiness that had let her walk out of his hall with her head high, when a lesser woman would have wept. He had called her a governess to wound her. He discovered she would indeed have made a wonderful one, being patient and exacting and quite unbribable, qualities, he reflected ruefully, that were teaching him a good deal. It was June when he asked her again, in the Rose Walk, with the emerald in his hand, because she had told him, weeks before, where she had left it and that it was his to offer or not as he chose. "Persephone," he said, "I ordered nothing and deserved nothing, and was sent a woman finer than I had the wit to recognize, and I spent an hour throwing her away and 4 months learning what I had done. I am asking you, not your father, not the contract, you, whether you will let me spend the rest of my life proving I have learned it, not because you must, because against every reason I have given you, you might wish to." She looked at the ring, and then at him, for a long moment. Then she held out her hand, not to take the ring from him, but to let him put it on her, which he understood was a different thing entirely, and his hands were not quite steady as he did it. "You may put it back," she said softly, "on the condition that you remember every single day that I gave it back once and was perfectly able to do so again. I find a husband does better who chose him freely and might, in principle, unchoose." "I shall remember it," said the Duke of Lowmoor, "every day of my life, and be grateful for the choosing every one of them." They married a second time, very quietly, in the small chapel, with the dowager who had rebuked him sitting in the front pew looking insufferably vindicated. And in the warm years that followed, when she beat him at chess and laughed at him for it, and ran his house and his temper with the same unbribable patience, Jonas would sometimes catch himself watching her across a room full of people and remember the worst thing he had ever said. "You are not what I ordered." He had been right, as it happened. She had not been what he ordered. She had been, by every measure that came to matter, immeasurably more, and he had been spared by her dignity and her mercy and his own slow, hard-won shame, the only fate he would truly have deserved, to have lost her, and never learned what he had thrown away.